I am absolutely delighted to introduce this panel we have for you today. We have Jaya Baloo, currently Chief Information Security Officer at Avast Software. She has worked in the cybersecurity area for nearly 20 years, and she won the Cybersecurity Executive of the Year Award in 2015 and is one of the top 100 influencers in the field. Dr. Robert Hercock is Chief Research Scientist for BT's Security Research Practice. He has over 20 years' experience in managing security research projects in the UK and was Theme Leader for Networks and Cybersecurity in the UK MOD Information Fusion Defence Technology Centre. Dr. Clarissa Rojas is a Research Associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk right here in Cambridge, where she works at the interface of science and policymaking at the project A Science of Global Risk. She is a Peruvian scientist that started her career as a researcher on molecular biology, neurosciences, biomedicine, and developmental biology. Thank you all for joining with me today for this panel. I'm super excited about hearing all your expertise. We're going to start off first. I believe, Clarissa, you have some slides and a talk for everyone, and then we'll move on to some questions for the panel. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Clarissa Rios Rojas. I work in a center where we are dedicated to the study and mitigation of risks that could lead to human extinction or civilization collapse. And for today's presentation, I would like to focus on a recent publication I made together with the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Frontier Risks. You can find this white paper. It's called Policy Pathways for an Economic Transformation. And the section where I have been contributing is section 6, Preparing for Frontier Risks in the New Economy. So you may be wondering, what are frontier risks? Well, you may have heard about rhinos and black swan events in the risk sphere. Well, in this chapter, we spotlight a unique kind of risk alongside the predicted and the almost impossible to predict. Frontier risks emerge at a frontier as technology surface or human and societal forces shift. These risks are characterized by their unknown likelihood, unknown impacts, or both. There are at least 4 critical realms in which humans are advancing and for which there is more limited understanding of whether, when, and how a specific risk will emerge. So number 1 will be advancing into new territorial and geographic frontiers, examples through space exploration, reaching ecological and environmental boundaries through geoengineering, for example, expanding frontiers in human communications through social networks and AI, and reaching new human technology frontiers through genetic enhancement. So in this white paper, what you're going to find is this matrix where we are localizing different types of frontier risks that we have identified. So some of them may be you may have heard about them already: militarization of space, genetic engineering enhancement, AI weaponry, human engineered pandemics, bioweapons, or the risk of AI superintelligence. So we believe that while decision makers must confront the risk of all categories, frontier risks require exploration for 3 different reasons. Number 1, the early warning signs are often subtle and difficult to detect. Number 2, these risks are less likely to be understood beyond a niche group of experts. And number 3, the uncertainty means they could manifest at any point with any magnitude. So in this white paper, you may find pathologies for risks that are common for all these frontier risks, but I would like to finish my presentation indicating some of the recommendations that we do in order to how to confront this frontier risk. Number 1 will be to use horizon scanning and tools and institutions to expand the risk universe. And we can do that by leveraging existing lists of risk as starting points. For example, in the UK, we have the Public National Risk Registry. And we could also use methodologies such as Delphi groups, which convene expert panels to consult on a particular issue or offer future scenario possibilities. Number 2 will be to explore organizations that focus on risk with uncertain characteristics. For example, our center, the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, the Center of the Future Intelligence, Future of Humanity Institute, Future of Life Institute, etc. We have different experts on different fields, and we have already some experience on policy engagement, so please contact us. Number 3 will be to call out and test assumptions, and we could do this by developing task forces composed of diverse cross-sectoral experts We could also invite senior experts to peer review crisis or management decisions in a scenario-based exercise, as maybe you heard about red teaming. And we should also maintain a direct line between risk managers and on-the-ground workers, because they are the ones that identify weak cues at the very beginning. Number four will be to identify and prioritize responsible actors where possible. So once risks are identified, we should target specific agencies to monitor and develop preparedness tactics for specific frontier risks. Number five, develop and communicate scenarios in a different way. And for that, you could use new narratives or extrasensory tools that could be art, gaming, or even virtual reality. Six, invest in a coordinating government body to oversee risk management and resilience. And this could be seen as risk units, creating frontier risk arms within your institution, or have a champion of foresight to oversee risk. Invest trained workforce in risk management. And the last one will be to consider resilience financing to build strategies for overcoming risk pathology into business models. For example, ensuring long-term frontier costs are incorporated into our current plans. So with that, I would like to say thank you, and I look forward to your questions. And just to point out to our recent publication about pathways to linking science and policy in the field of global risk. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Clarissa. It's a very comprehensive overview of the area and responses. I'd like to open it up to the other two panelists now if you have any immediate responses to the presentation, or if you have any questions or particular comments that you want to make on that.
I like your point 5 in particular, Clarissa, about the narratives and extrasensory tools. We have a wide range of VR, AR, augmentation reality type capabilities now, and we have to start using those to enhance decision making. Too often we end up in groupthink, and then also the narrative point that we forget how to construct a narrative that everyone can engage in. I'll end that comment to that point. Jaya, if you want to comment.
Yeah, no, so I wanted to say that I think it's really interesting to explore the dual-sided nature of pretty much every technology. So understanding that the predominant initiation for a lot of technologies, that it's going to do a lot of good, but understanding the counter side and really being able to do that with a bit of academic rigor, examining every single technology consistently for what is that dual use potential, and really trying to harness the best stuff that would have a positive influence on society.
Yeah, I wonder if we could raise another subject there as well, the role of trust in preparing for risk. Robert, would you like to speak to that?
Sure, yeah. It's one of my favorite topics, strangely enough. But what I worry about is one of the problems of the internet, the way we've gone, is a massive increase in disinformation, noise, fake news, fake information. And an example would be if we go back in time to, say, the 1980s, the world then faced an existential risk, which was the depletion of the ozone layer. From the 70s into the 80s, we begin to sense the problem. The scientific community identified it. A solution was proposed. We understood it was the CFC gases causing it. And amazingly, the world came together, political decisions were taken, and the Montreal Protocol 1987 agreements were reached and then abided by. And that problem is largely being addressed, with a few exceptions. So that was possible. So that was a really nice textbook example of how we can address existential risk. But the key factor there is trust. There was trust within the scientific community, trust within the communication from the science to the policy making. We had a relatively higher trust environment. And I worry now that one of the issues of the whole cybersecurity domain is it's dissolving that trust, the bonds of trust that exist within society. And unfortunately, that's critical in this existential risk context, because we won't be able to identify the potential risk that's emerging, as Clarissa was indicating earlier, that just identifying what the risk is can be extremely challenging. So you need to trust the sensory process, and then trust between the actors when you reach a protocol, reach a decision, that all actors are going to abide by whatever the decision is. So this trust dimension is not technical as such. We may look at technical solutions, so it's going to be a challenging process to actually bring forward and actually achieve a mechanism to do so. Maybe we have a global blockchain aligned around major risk parameters, but identifying the issue and responding to it is going to need better trust models, I think.
So I think sometimes with some of these risk issues, particularly around the kind of amorphous understanding the public has of cybersecurity, particular examples are really useful. So the Colonial pipeline attack recently, I think perhaps Jaya, if you could explain why that's an important example and what actually happened and what we can learn from it as well.
Well, so there's a couple of things. So I'm not sure if everyone's aware of the Colonial pipeline attack, but what happened was you basically had a group, and we've given attribution to Russia for having a cybercrime group, and they were using ransomware as a service. So basically a software platform that anyone can log into, pay, and then execute attacks from that platform. And this particular platform was then used by a host of different cyber criminals, but hosted as a service by one. And this platform was then used to attack Colonial Pipeline, which is a pipeline that produces and then transports oil towards the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. So what they had was an attack which didn't allow them to continue their production process. And in order to ensure that the attacker wasn't going to cause some sort of physical disruption, they had to shut down the entire thing for several days. On the eastern seaboard of the US, they declared a state of emergency, so the impact was pretty high and pretty significant. And what they finally wound up doing was paying roughly $5 million US in order to get a decryption key to be able to get back into business. Now, the impact of this is far-reaching. It points to several different things. The fact that we don't know about attacks. This is a piece of critical infrastructure. This is, if not state-sponsored, at least state-harbored cybercrime, that it is incredibly difficult to detect in the wild, and it's highly successful for actually getting this financial intimidation for the victim to pay, because the cost, $4 million, is nothing when you take a look at the total revenue of a couple of $100 million of such an oil pipeline. So they'll happily pay these kinds of things. And it also becomes really worrying when you understand that they don't just get the decryption key to go and get back into business, but they also have this possibility now to basically take that stolen data and put it online at any time. There's no honor amongst thieves. Once you pay these cyber criminals, there's no guarantee that they'll do the good thing, step away and step back. So I think it points a whole bunch of systematic errors and malfunctions that we haven't been able to address excuse me, in cybersecurity.
Now, is that classed as an existential threat? Because in terms of direct impact to human lives, is that something we also need to think about gradations of categories as well?
Absolutely, because again, it's about the crossover to the physical. There are a few attacks that can actually, have this kinetic shift. But when we're talking about critical infrastructure, we're also talking about the hospitals. We're also talking about nuclear installations. We're talking about all of this critical infrastructure, which these days doesn't have enough of an air gap, if you will, between the technology, the human, and then actual accessibility from a logical perspective. So we've really crossed these lines to the extent of which our entire society, and we've seen that with COVID-19, we're incredibly dependent on everything that is digitally connected. So I would see it as a looming threat, which we're not always confident that we understand where the heck it's coming from and what it actually means for our society as a whole. Another example is the SolarWinds attack, which we're going to talk about later. We don't understand how interconnected we all are. We have no idea. So these tiny little software companies, out of nowhere, there's an attack, and suddenly, oh my God, hundreds of companies, multiple government agencies have a fallout from that. So, yeah.
Does anyone want to follow up on that? Okay. I said it's sometimes useful to have a direct example for public understanding, but we're living through a direct example at the moment of a global existential risk. So this is likely also not the last one. How can we prepare for such large-scale natural events? Clarissa, with your background in biological sciences, do you think there's anything particular that we can do to prepare for for future and forthcoming pandemic events?
Yes, I think what we all have to put in our minds is that there is no three top solutions, but it's more like a holistic group of solutions. And I see that from the COVID-19 crisis, there are many lessons at a global level, local level that we can learn from. And I think that incorporating this into the curricula of as early as secondary school to talk about why people was not wearing the mask, what were the consequences of that, and even coming up with the idea of some colleagues at CISO are doing to create an artistic presentation in a museum to show and showcase how the impact of COVID has been seen in different parts of the world, and also incorporated into the curriculum of universities to talk more about global catastrophic risks. Now it was a natural pandemic, but what will happen if it would have been a human-engineered pandemic? And I think there are many efforts that have been seen during these pandemics, as well as, for example, in Africa, how many different countries unite together in order to get better prices for medicine and supplements that they needed for the hospitals. And there are many lessons from here and there that we could use. And the other thing that I think that we should strengthen is the trust in the scientific knowledge, and how we can have our citizens and policymakers as our allies. And I think that requires a lot of, as you were saying before, a lot of trust building. And that can only happen with innovative ways to present our research. For example, some months ago, we did comics for a bioengineering foresight paper that is very technical, but then bringing it to future scenarios of how the future could look like. It's a good way to interact with different people. And also, we are all in September, we're producing workshops where we bring policymakers, decision makers with academics to think together, how do we want this trust building to start?
Yeah, Robert.
So, Beth, I mean, a specific example was last year when the COVID crisis started in the UK. BT suffered from a large number of arson attacks against mobile base station towers, where people believed it was a 5G tower, and they've been told through the disinformation online that 5G was causing COVID, that the radiation from 5G has some kind of connection, which is complete pseudoscience nonsense that was being spread through the internet, which again is an example of there was an erosion of trust taking place between society and the scientific community. So if you amplify that going forward, and we do have a future existential risk crisis, just that social to decision-making process has to be reinforced or made stronger somehow.
We see it happening again, of course, with the vaccine rollout. We have an enormous amount of people who are not yet vaccinated, but also never want to be. So I think we have this fundamental dilemma of disinformation, which is used as a tool, which could actually be a reason or a root cause of some other manifestation of an existential crisis.
Yeah, I think it's important to think more about the role of narratives. One thing I wanted to bring up in regards to our perceptions of artificial intelligence in particular is whether we should be more concerned about examples of artificial stupidity where AI goes wrong because of human error, or the more exponential view that even Boris Johnson, our PM here, spoke about when he spoke to the UN. He talked about the pink-eyed Terminator bots. Well, I will correct him; they're red-eyed. But is it a danger as well that the narratives that form online and are shared about the future of artificial intelligence, much as we see with the misinformation about COVID, actually distract and get in the way of actual concerns about rogue AI and technical security? Yeah, Robert?
So, I never lose sleep over Terminators. I do lose sleep over people misusing AI in a context where it shouldn't be applied. So, there are many states looking at application of autonomous weapons platforms, or advancing malicious scientific users using machine learning and AI capabilities. But then it's not the AI that's the problem, it's human beings doing something stupid with the AI. So I like this term, artificial stupidity. It sums up, there's nothing wrong with the underlying technology, it's what human beings are doing with it. But I don't think Terminator is what we have to worry about. Misuse of that technology is the key factor.
Beth, if I can give an example, the thing that we talked about before, I think it's really, when we take a look at things like that, it's about things like quantum computing, where we know that there is a really cool technology coming up that would have a lot of scientific application and potentially solve some fundamental scientific challenges. It's not going to be there for everyone, but this also presents a fundamental threat, because we know that there are already algorithms that would actually deprecate the current algorithm set that we use now. For things like encryption, which we use every day for our banking and to actually establish trust. between companies and governments, et cetera. And if we look at the quantum computing threat, I think that is actually something that we haven't yet understood, because it presents this potential for supremacy by certain nation states above others who may not have access or the ability to have such technology. So I would see like the equitable access to certain technologies also posing a fundamental threat.
Yeah. Clarissa, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, so something that came to my mind immediately was the term of epistemic security. In the same way, like we have cybersecurity, biosecurity, epistemic securities, to make sure that the knowledge that we are producing is going to be untouchable, because it's going to be reaching the citizens in a way that it was produced, and not as fake news or like using part of it in order to distort some facts. And I think that's quite important for all the efforts that we are doing, together with all the efforts on ethical, as my colleague also mentioned, that ethics should be important part of our mission on how to prepare for frontier risks.
Excellent. Yeah, I think Clarissa's presentation laid out some really useful steps, but what would an existential risk toolkit for companies look like? What sort of preparations would be needed to get ahead of these sort of problems, the unknown unknowns, I suppose? To come on that.
Should I just start? I think every company has, some risk and compliance management practice, and usually what they start doing is start with like a risk appetite assessment by determining what are the risks that we already know about, and they do the usual thing. But I think they don't always take into account all of the potential additional existential risks that would actually form or constitute a fundamental continuity risk for that company themselves. And we have to make sure that they're equipped to do that, because I don't feel that future or frontier risk space is something that's necessarily explored. And it's usually much more short-term thinking that's done at the board level rather than the longer term. And, I think those are the kinds of things. Like if I would think about a toolkit, it would be about how do you systematically engineer that kind of thinking within the processes of a company in order to discuss them at board level.
Yeah, Robert?
Yeah, so going back to Clarissa's point about narrative, a way of doing that is through storyboarding for the boards, the executive policyholders, such that they can envisage what's possible. Often, as I said, there's very short-term thinking usually. So to make that longer term, you need to engage people who can tell stories, narrative. And specific point I'll come on to later is the whole issue of diversity, mental and cultural diversity in the group. Often we focus on the race, gender issue, brilliant. But we don't actually think, how are people thinking differently within this dialogue? And that requires a much broader cultural and cognitive diversity, which is harder to measure and harder to process, but we need.
Yeah, I think that the most important points from what we wrote in the white paper, I think for me, will be to really allocate some budget to build this risk management and resilience task force or foresight champion, because from there you can come up with different strategies that are in agreement with the priorities of your company and with the needs that they have and with the resources that they have at the moment. Something else that I would like to add is that they should also think about going beyond their own institutions, organizations, and bring a little bit of citizen engagement into these conversations and try to hear what's happening with people that is being maybe affected by this risk in the future, and just have a bi-directional communication with them. That will for sure improve any resilience and projects for the future.
It's actually a really interesting point, Clarissa, because I know that most companies publish in their annual reports how they've addressed some of the risks that they should be considering. And it's usually a token of maturity where they address additional types of subjects that are beyond that immediate scope or that midterm scope. I mean, they're never going to talk about the risk of hostile takeover in their annual report because, kind of tipping the potential takeover party. But it is really good, I think, that they can show some domain maturity and look beyond themselves at addressing some of these other things.
Good. So we have a couple of minutes before we move on to public Q&A, but I think it would be good if each one of you sort of prepared what you think is the final thought you'd like the audience to sort of take away with them if they were going to start thinking about preparing for existential threats and risks. We start with Jaya and move around alphabetically. That's not alphabetical. I've done it alphabetical by surname. Jaya, Robert. Sorry.
If I would have one thing, I think it would be that really thinking about that fundamental interdependency. If I take a look at a lot of the risks that have manifested, it's primarily because we don't understand how things are interconnected. So having this approach where you both take what is it I have and then extrapolate it to what do I see coming up on the horizon, I think is the best approach to actually, trying to have some sort of rigor in how we plan for things in the future. Also, those things we can't plan.
Robert.
Two quick points. One is the one I mentioned earlier about diversity, the need for cognitive diversity and social cultural diversity in any decision-making process, which is sometimes a challenge. So by definition, those people tend to be excluded from the executive policy-making level. The second point is kind of linking back to Jaya's point. We need a better understanding of complex adaptive systems. So often, security is a complex adaptive system problem. It includes everything from the psychology, the economics, the technology, the people, society dimensions, but they're not part of the conversation usually. So, and also understanding that science helps you understand the network connections and the feedback loops that can take place. It's a hard topic, but it needs to be engaged.
Clarissa.
Yeah, I think to add to the group, I would say to please see scientists as allies. We are already working on our policy engagements. We are in a mature level now. We know how to interact with different stakeholders, be in government, civil society, or the industry. So please just reach out because we are very keen on starting this conversation and trust building.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, all the panelists. Now we'll move on to public questions. I can see we've had one about a link for the frontier risk paper, but I think that's been resolved. So it is available if you follow CSER online. It is also available through their website, and they've tweeted about it as well. But there's a link with the WEF forum as well. And then another question here. The ozone hole is an example of an anti-catastrophe, a risk that never eventuated. What does the panel see as some future equivalent anti-catastrophe?
I'm hoping it'll be an anti-catastrophe, but I live in the Netherlands, and seawater rising is something that we're definitely worried about. I mean, if we say no matter what, we're going to experience higher temperatures, but the impact on sea levels is something that, for the Netherlands in any case, and for every coastal community, is a fundamental existential risk we better be able to combat.
Yeah, I think the aim is to bring all these frontier risks to a point that they will never happen, and that's why we emphasize so much on prevention and not mitigation. Mitigation will be like the second level. And to my mind, I think one of the things that are constantly in my realm of talks is genetic enhancement. You may remember the Chinese twins that had a genetic editing. Now they are they cannot get HIV. But in the future, what may happen is that perhaps some corporations see as a business to do enhancement of babies in other things. I want my child to have plays the piano very well or have social capacities that are enhanced. It's not just about the color of your eyes or how your hair curls up. It's more about these personality enhancements that we may want to think twice about it. And also with the Chinese babies, for example, there are policies that are not in place. Who owns their genetic data? They are going to be investigated for years until they are 18 years old. Their parents are in charge to allow that the genetic data is shared with researchers and maybe with the wider audiences. So these things are not already in the government's eyes. So I think we need to prepare more for those.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have some of this manifesting already. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. But to be very quick, 23andMe already sold their users' data. I believe, was it to Pfizer or La Roche? Anyway, the point is that some of this stuff has already happened. The cat is kind of out of the bag. And you have open genome projects and Nebula Genomics, which promises to keep your privacy intact and your cybersecurity also okay, but at a much higher price. So finally, the worry that I have is security is only for those who can afford it.
That's what I was going to jump in with. this is all about cost. So risk mitigation is a cost function. So some calculations of COVID, like about $100 to $200 million into the World Health Organization would have helped prevent the pandemic, whereas the cost is now running to many trillions. So the cost of any existential risk is thousands of times greater than the mitigation, but will society pay that insurance dividend up front? And that goes back to the trust issue. So if you don't trust the science, if you don't trust the people saying to you, by the way, you need to take out a policy on this, then you won't. Society won't.
And can I say, sorry, like just to add to that, no, there's one more threat that I think is so interesting that we didn't talk about. And Clarissa, I don't know if that's in the paper or not, but I was reading about, there's, I forgot what the name of the project is, but there is a video by Bill Nye, and it's part of the Society of Astronomers who are citizen astronomers who are looking for meteors and other near-Earth objects that could crash to Earth. And I know this sounds really far-fetched, but I feel like if we're worried about citizen scientists because we don't have the full scope of everything that is happening that would be considered in near-Earth range, I wonder if we're also looking at these things with a proper long-term approach and systematically.
Mm. Yes, Clarissa, did you want to come in there?
Well, just to bring Robert's point to some examples, the Biological Weapon Convention unit that supports our member states in that field has the budget of one McDonald's, and it seems also that we humans we spend more money buying ice cream than giving budget to these type of organizations that are really taking care of these bio risks that don't happen. So I think it's interesting to think about these things. Some months ago also I read that the Avatar new movie is going to have, I think, 1 billion in money, and sometimes I feel that money could also be used for other type of frontier risk or global catastrophic risk that humanity may be impaired in the future. So let's just think about our entertainment ideas and what do we value more in the long-term process.
Or billionaires popping up into space for huge amounts of money. As a question come in, can the panel dig deeper into recommendation number 8 on Clarissa's list? So we'll start with Clarissa, perhaps. Consider resilience financing. So could you dig deeper into that, and then perhaps the panelists can come in.
Yeah, I think that with this point, what we wanted to show is that don't think about this type of risk as something that is not gonna provide some. It's not an investment. It is an investment. I think that's why they link it to the terminology of resilience financing, and just ensuring that you have these frontier costs and long-term thinking into your current budget plans is what we are advocating.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to help unpack that?
The cost function is complex because, for example, like in the ransomware attacks taking place, like the Colonial pipeline, the attackers often know how much insurance cover you have, and they'll charge you whatever then the maximum cover they know you have. So even if a company takes out that insurance, then it's being used against them. So there's a complex cycle going on.
I think it might be smarter, because this isn't absolutely true, what Rojas said, but the issue here is that we might want to think about what it's required from a regulatory perspective. So, for example, if a company is listed, that they would need to have some amount of their revenue for this resilience financing as a buffer to deal with some of these threats that would cause instability and volatility on the market. Maybe it's a requirement of the top 100 companies or something within exchange, or I think it's also worthwhile examining what types of regulatory stimuli you can do, also against financing ransomware, for example, because it's seen as a victimless crime.
Yeah. After the 2008 crash, a lot of the banks have had this mandated buffers that they have to maintain now. So in the banking world, that kind of did take place after 2008. So, Beth.
I just pasted some part of our report talking about these 3 points of providing innovative insurance solutions that can bridge gaps between frontier risks and opportunities, determine critical infrastructure assets and develop a plan for investment in them, and build strategies for overcoming risk pathologies into business models. Those 3 things.
Okay, another question. Returning back to artificial intelligence, do all the panelists agree that there is no risk from intelligent AI itself, but only from stupid misuse? Isn't it the case that even very clever, well-meaning people can make subtle mistakes?
I'm not sure I agree that that's the only use of AI. I mean, we already see the bias that's there in certain algorithms, and I think that bias is actually much deeper, and it goes to the point of that was made earlier about diversity. Even here, I think if you have created a system, it's going to be a reflection of the authors. So I think there's a lot more than just misuse that we need to worry about, not just specifically for AI, but for other technologies that would have such a fundamental role to play in making decisions in our future.
I think something important with any type of technology is that when a risk is breached, when something has gone wrong, for example, I can think about all the times that, for example, a virus has leaked, or a bacteria that was genetically engineered may have crossed the boundaries of the laboratories. These type of things have to be documented, because then we can learn from it, and then we can prepare better for the future. And I think that's something that is not happening at the moment or in the past. And I think that's something that we should also think in terms of AI. And every time that something we think we can detect these weak cues, just to make it open, transparent, let's let experts talk about it. Let's see what citizens think about it, and think on how to prevent instead of mitigate again.
Mm-hmm.
Longer term, I kind of have a slight concern that we'll get something that I call the HAL problem, like from 2001: Space Odyssey, where the computer acts maliciously because it's been given conflating instructions. And I think in the future we may have, as you turn up the autonomy dial, by definition, you're making something more autonomous. You're giving it more control. So there's ultimately a trade-off in terms of how much control you have of something that you've given that level of autonomy to. So society has to make a choice. How far do you turn that dial on what systems, and then how do you regulate it? Who polices that process?
I would love to have a long conversation with you about Hal and his autonomy. But moving on to another question from the public here. Toby Ord, author of The Precipice, argues that natural risks such as comets crashing to Earth are an order of magnitude less likely than human-caused risks. Do the panelists agree?
Yeah, maybe I can just say quickly that for these type of events, we can still go back to history and try to make some models and predictions based on how many times like a comet has come. And nowadays we have also some sort of measurements to see how close it's passing by. And also NASA is developing this program just to be prepared in case of asteroid collide. But with the other technological risk is where we don't have this data to base on, and we have to think that foresight and future scenarios is the key to help us to think about them. So yeah, I definitely agree with Toby in this case.
Okay, I think because we're running out of time a little bit, just to answer the question, could the other two panelists either say agree or disagree?
It goes back to the cost, the impact versus probability. So in terms of asteroid impact, the cost could be extremely high. Probability probably very low.
Yes. And I think fundamentally, if we take a look at Pompeii, they would disagree. But I think we still need to have some preparation for these events and have some investment and financing for just the eventuality. That's all. Support the Planetary Society.
Yes.
I think we're at the end of the session now and the end of the questions. Okay. There are a few more questions coming in. Perhaps the askers can get in touch through social media. The conversation can continue elsewhere, but I think we're going to have to wrap up now. So thank you very much to all my panelists today. Such an interesting conversation. I feel very privileged to be a part of it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, folks. Thank you.
Thanks.